Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. We live in an era when physical threats are not the only challenge facing believers. The real struggle is often hidden, subtle, internal. A war rages in hearts, minds, and intentions, frequently unnoticed, taking shape through soft whispers, gradual erosion, and insidious encouragements. When we consider how a hostile force, unseen yet persistent, works to mislead, distract, and corrupt believers in our age, we begin to see the danger in the commonplace, the trap in the familiar, and the threat in the everyday. In 2025, the environment is unlike that of earlier centuries. There is unprecedented access to information, entertainment, constant connection, and simultaneity of voices. At every moment, screens beckon with brightness, voices compete for attention, suggestions pour in, and temptations wear new guises. Against this backdrop, the assaults on a believer are adapted, refined, and relentless. The first line of attack is distraction. When the believer's mind becomes overburdened with trivialities, endless scrolling of social media feeds, viral videos, notifications, trending debates, those moments which should be reserved for reflection, for supplication, for reading the book are squeezed out. The heart, once attuned to the remembrance of the Lord, becomes dull. The tongue, once conscious of the need to glorify, becomes slack. These distractions are not overt temptations, but slow suffocators of spiritual life. A message pings reply, a video autoplays watch, a debate ignites center. Over time, the believer comes to accept that busyness is piety, that constant engagement is virtue, that silence or pause is waste. The very weapons used are tools we think are benign or even beneficial, yet their accumulation suffocates the soul's capacity for connection with the divine. Alongside the ceaseless noise, another form of assault is normalization of what was once shocking. In past generations, certain acts of immorality, indecent speech, corruption of virtue, would be condemned openly, rejected by common conscience. But today, through films, songs, memes, advertisements, jokes, and half-truths, disobedience is subtly framed as liberation, permissiveness is spoken of as progress, and boundaries are dismissed as outdated. When the mind is exposed to repeated images or jokes, the barrier of shame erodes. When sinful ideas are celebrated, the believer's defenses weaken. What was once intolerable becomes tolerable. What was once forbidden becomes part of the accepted package. The assault is gradual, first a joke, then a tolerance, then an embrace, and eventually an identity. The believer may not wake up one morning and choose rebellion. Rather, over months or years, the boundary moves inward until virtue seems austere and compromise seems moderate. Concurrently, confusion is introduced into belief. The enemy does not always aim for outright disbelief. Far more effective is planting seeds of uncertainty. Is this really what Islam meant? Maybe the old interpretations no longer apply. Isn't Islam supposed to evolve? What if we misread certain verses? Such thoughts are not pushed violently, but whispered. Especially among younger minds seeking authenticity and relevance, such doubts can breed. As uncertainty grows, the believer begins to lean on personal reasoning more than on tradition, on emotion rather than guidance, on desire rather than discipline. When the ground of certainty is unsettled, the believer becomes susceptible to adopting ideas, religious or secular, that seem attractive, just, or modern, even if they contradict foundational truths. The assault is subtle because it masquerades as inquiry. It looks like open-minded thinking, progressive thought, or religious reform, but underneath it divides heart from guidance. Another domain of attack is interpersonal friction and division. Even when two believers stand on common ground, pride, stubbornness, and ego whisper in their ear. The threads of unity among the community are frayed by envy, sarcasm, verbal jabs, sectarianism, and criticism. Instead of mercy, we see harshness. Instead of soft speech, we see mockery. Instead of listening, we see scorn. When believers feud over minor differences, the spark of discord spreads as the community fractures. Collective strength, the shared support, and the communal remembrance weaken. The hidden enemy translates small disagreements into deep wounds, small irritations into lasting grudges, small insults into division. While we suppose we are defending truth, we may actually be sustaining bitterness. And as hearts cool toward one another, the ambient love for the Deen cools with it. Yet another way this enemy strikes is envy, jealousy, and comparison. The believer is shown through curated lives on screens how others live better, appear more successful, enjoy more comfort or youthful appearance, possess more wealth or fame. The heart burns inwardly, gratitude fades. The believer begins to covet, to resent, to measure his own worth by external status. The comparison trap drains contentment, and even righteous deeds become tainted by seeking praise or prestige, instead of sincere worship. One may act for reputation. Instead of genuine charity, one may sacrifice out of show, and gradually the heart is bent. Enmity toward what others have weakens reliance on what Allah has provided. The attack is effective because it leverages a natural human weakness and amplifies it through mass media, highlight reels, and selective exposure. In addition, procrastination becomes a powerful instrument. The voice says, begin tomorrow, start next week, repent when you find time. Those commitments to renewed worship, memorization, fasting, charity, each postponed gently, delayed by plausible excuses, hidden by the busy calendar. Year after year, the believer tells himself, soon I'll be better. Meanwhile, the opportunity diminishes. What was once urgent becomes nebulous. The moment of resolve passes, and the heart grows harder. The danger is not immediate annihilation, but slow erosion. The delay, over time, becomes refusal, and the refusal becomes neglect. And so the believer, ever intending, never arriving, drifts. Another invasion works in the sphere of overconfidence and complacency. If a person sees themselves as pious, they can fall into self-delusion, neglecting introspection and humility. The thought arises, I am safe, I am stronger than most, I have no grave sins, and thus vigilance is lowered. The heart becomes blind to subtle faults. The believer may judge others harshly while dismissing their own weaknesses. When the enemy sees complacency, gates of arrogance and hypocrisy open wide. So the assault is sometimes to lull us into a false security. Moreover, emotional turmoil is used as a weapon. Loss, pain, injustice, heartbreak, anxiety, fear all triggers our opportunities. When the believer is distressed, the whisperer nudges toward despair, bitterness, resentment, anger, or distraction by ephemeral comforts. Instead of turning to the divine, one may turn to destructive coping, addiction, escapism, worldliness. Grief becomes a tool to weaken trust, to question mercy, to isolate oneself. What could have been a pathway toward submission becomes instead a chasm of disconnection. The mind, unsettled, searches for distraction. The heart, wounded, resents accountability, and faith is tested. The less resilient the soul, the stronger the push. Financial temptation is another vector, the allure of quick gain, shady deals. Gambling, unethical partnerships, exploitation. all presented as normalized risk or entrepreneurial boldness. The believer may be coaxed to compromise honesty, to shortcut fairness, to accept bribes, to evade accountability. Prophet seduces the conscience, and excuse after excuse is crafted. At first, it's small, a little stretch, a little lie, a little bending, then it becomes permitted in the heart. The assault specializes in framing compromise as pragmatism, deception as strategy, shortcuts as cleverness. The believer may justifying minor corruptions, not seeing that the slip is the start of the slide, the justification, the beginning of the trap. Social influence and peer pressure are yet more subtle tools. Friends, admired figures, community leaders, influencers, those admired or followed, often become conduits of misguidance when they minimize boundaries, glamorize sin, or encourage laxity in worship. The believer seeks belonging, approval, acceptance, and so may adjust boundaries to fit in. When the circle normalizes what was once against the standard, the heart concedes. We may not realize that our circle has grown dark until we find ourselves far from light. Thus, worship, dress, speech, and conduct are gradually compromised to match the group, to avoid blame, to maintain social currency. Likewise, overemphasis on worldly success status, recognition, certificates, titles, influence can become a mask which hides spiritual decline. The believer devotes more energy toward career, reputation, credentials, influence, followers, likes. Worship becomes secondary, charity becomes branding, humility becomes public display, and the inner life is neglected. The result is a life that appears successful by worldly standards but hollow in its inner core. The accident is that spiritual failure remains hidden behind a facade of achievement. When the assault is on ambition and identity, the believer becomes trapped by what he does rather than who he is in relation to the divine. Intellectual pride is deployed to mislead as well. A believer who studies may become arrogant, thinking he knows more than scholars, discarding humility, making dismissive judgments, turning knowledge into weapon rather than tool. The voice encourages criticism of classical scholars, undermining respect for tradition, favoring radical reinterpretation without grounding. Believer believes he is more enlightened than those who preceded. This pride is both sin and vulnerability. It blinds the heart, hardens arrogance, and weakens sincerity. The enemy never confronts with brute force, but co-opts the mind with vanity. A persistent attack is the distortion of intention. Every act can be questioned. Was that prayer for Allah or to be seen? Was that charity to help or to impress? Was that fasting out of devotion or to claim piety? The whisperer magnifies the seed of insincerity, nudges toward doubt in one's own motives, sowing insecurity in one's good deeds. No one wants to worship in vanity, so the believer may despair of sincerity and even abandon acts lest they be tainted. The very inner struggle of intention becomes battlefield territory. Elder generations warned that intentions are weights. Indeed, they are targets. Furthermore, loneliness and isolation are tools. When a believer feels disconnected from community, unsupported, misunderstood, he becomes vulnerable. In isolation, the voice gets louder. In distance from righteous company, one's own resolve weakens. When there is no close friend reminding of fear of the last day, no brother or sister calling one to prayer, the distance grows. The believer slowly drifts, seeking solace in the wrong places, accepting companions who mock or distract or scorn. Constant comparison of one's inner weaknesses to others also plays a part. The believer is shown those who appear superficially stronger. He may despair, I am worse than so, and so they are more consistent. I cannot compare. That despair is a trap. Rather than lean on mercy, one becomes demotivated. The enemy uses unbalanced mirrors. He shows only the peaks of others, the valleys of your own journey. You forget your own progress, your own mercy, your own capacity to return. At times, the whisperer will give permission to small sins, minimize them, show them harmless, or categorize them as just this once. The believer is lulled into compromise, believing small transgressions are acceptable because they don't seem grave. Over time, multiple small sins accumulate until the heart is cluttered with regret and distance. The attack is in the incremental. The heart doesn't break suddenly, it withers. When the believer repents, the voice says, "You have sinned too much, you're beyond hope. Allah would not accept you now." Thus guilt becomes a barrier, not a doorway. The believer distances from worship, believing himself unworthy, but despair is a betrayal of mercy. The assault is to stop the return before it begins. Yet even worship itself is not exempt. The believer may perform rituals mechanically, without feeling, without connection, without humility. The whisper suggests, your recitation is low quality, your concentration is poor, what's the use? So the believer doubts the value of prayer, abandons it partially, or becomes inconsistent. What began as sincere becomes routine. The heart withdraws while the body appears erect in worship. Another aspect is focusing excessively on minor ritual technicalities while neglecting the spirit. One might obsess over minor errors, minutiae, external correctness, while the heart remains dead. The enemy encourages legalism without love, form without substance. The believer may see outward compliance, but inward emptiness. He may feel superior for his observance, while his compassion, sincerity, and humility erode. The war is not against ritual, but where ritual loses its heart. Sensual temptation continues its many guises, subtle gestures, suggestive imagery, flippant jokes, flirting, normalized intimacy outside bounds. The media, entertainment industry, easy accessibility to prohibited content, they all conspire to weaken resistance. Before one commits, one often is drawn by images, thoughts, jokes, comments. The whisperer prepares the mind for transgression. Recognition of modesty erodes gradually. The believer may not intend the fall, but he is softened by repeated exposure. Physical health and vanity are also targets. The believer may become overly preoccupied with appearance, fitness, trends, body image. When self-image becomes the focus, worship becomes secondary, humility is lost, and effort becomes toward impression rather than worship. The enemy whispers that beauty is for display, that modesty is straitjacketing, that outward perfection gains acceptance. The believer may neglect the inner self while polishing the outer. Similarly, the dimensions of time and planning are attacked. The believer is guided to mismanage time, procrastinate, fill every slot with lesser things, refuse silence, refuse solitude. Days are swallowed by routine. Weeks pass with little spiritual progress. The enemy's success is when the believer looks back at a year and sees how little changed. Then despair or complacency sets in. The cycle repeats. When roles and responsibilities weaken, family, marriage, parenthood, community service become burdens rather than opportunities. The believer may resent obligations, neglect their children's religious upbringing, disconnect from spouse, avoid communal work. Over time, the family unit crumbles. Faith is not transmitted. Roots grow shallow. The enemy is patient. It works across generations. Often, the attack is disguised as commendable self-care, mental health, moderation, flexibility. These are good in themselves, but when emphasized so heavily that sacrifice, discipline, surrender are dismissed. They become traps. The believer may justify leniency in worship, avoidance of sacrifice, partial observance under the banner of balance. The enemy wraps laxity in attractive garments. The believer may not see that ease has become the standard and obedience the burden. Throughout all this, believers' connection to knowledge is eroded. Instead of seeking deep understanding, one collects shallow summaries, tweets, snippets, short lectures, quick takes. The believer does not go deep, reflect, revise, refine. Knowledge becomes like fast food, consumed, forgotten, replaced, without depth. The heart remains unanchored. When difficulties come, superficial knowledge fails. The whisperer encourages skip, shortcut, opinion over scholarship. The believer begins to believe that he knows enough already, but real resilience comes from deep roots of knowledge. Finally, the environment itself is weaponized. Cultural trends, laws, social norms shift gradually to oppose divine guidance. Laws may legalize what is immoral. Institutions may favor corruption. Public spaces may empower vice. The believer is pressured continuously, conform or be marginalized, adapt or be isolated. Cumulative weight of surroundings presses on belief, slows resolve, and corrodes conviction. The believer's strength is tested not in a moment, but in a lifetime of small compromises. In such a world, the attacks are many, varied, subtle, and overlapping. The believer may not feel a single blow. Instead, the heart gradually grows distant, the tongue becomes lazy, the resolve weakens, the eyes wander, the listening ears dull, the compassion cools. The internal fortress is breached not by a mighty siege, but by hundreds of tiny holes, each one unnoticed until the structure weakens. The challenge is to become aware of the invisible war, to watch the self, to guard the heart, to renew connection, to seek knowledge, to fellowship with the righteous, to fasten one's commitment to the one who sees the unseen, to choose submission while many choose ease, to remember that despite what the world may whisper, obedience is still nourishment, sacrifice is still dignity, and the straight path is still the way.